The air was crisp in the early morning as Jack Thompson, a 22-year-old logger, wiped the sweat from his brow and took in the scent of pine and damp earth. He had been working deep in the Oregon wilderness for 3 weeks now, part of a seasonal crew sent to clear deadfall and maintain fire breaks near the rushing Bitter Creek River. The job was tough, the hours long, but Jack had grown up in the outdoors, raised by a father who had been a ranger before him. He relished the solitude of the forest and found peace in the rhythmic sound of his axe striking wood. That morning, after a long stretch of clearing debris near the riverbank, he decided to take a break. He set his tools down on a moss-covered log and walked towards the water, drawn by the sound of the rushing current. The Bitter Creek was higher than usual, swollen with recent rains, its icy waters surging past rocks with relentless force. As Jack stood there, taking a sip from his canteen, he noticed movement upstream. At first, he thought it was just a log tumbling through the rapids, but then he saw it again, a frantic thrashing, something struggling against the powerful current. His pulse quickened. It was an animal. He stepped closer to the edge, narrowing his eyes. The creature's dark fur was slick and waterlogged, its small limbs fighting to stay afloat. Then he realized it was a bear cub. Panic surged through him. The cub must have slipped into the water, carried downstream by the fast-moving current. It was struggling to keep its head above water, its tiny paws clawing against the invisible force dragging it toward the jagged rocks further down. Jack glanced around, searching for any sign of the mother bear, but the dense forest remained eerily silent. His gut twisted. If the mother was nearby, she would be in a frenzy by now. But there was no roaring, no crashing through the underbrush. The cub was alone. Without another thought, Jack ran along the riverbank, following the cub's erratic path. He could see its movements growing weaker, the frantic splashing slowing as exhaustion set in. He had only seconds to act. His boots skidded on the damp ground as he spotted a narrow bend, where the water momentarily slowed, before plunging into a deeper section filled with sharp rocks. That was his chance. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped his pack, ripped off his heavy jacket, and sprinted to a fallen tree that extended partway over the water. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs as he climbed onto the trunk, his arms outstretched. The cub was almost upon him, its tiny black eyes wide with fear. Jack gritted his teeth, steadying himself against the slippery bark. "Come on, little guy," he murmured, reaching out just as the cub was swept under the tree's edge. With one desperate lunge, Jack plunged his hands into the freezing water, grasping wildly. His fingers brushed against wet fur, but the force of the current nearly pulled him in. He dug his knees into the bark, gripping with everything he had, then tried again. This time, his hand closed firmly around the scruff of the cub's neck. It let out a weak, high-pitched cry, flailing as Jack yanked it out of the water with all his strength. The force nearly sent him toppling into the river, but he managed to twist back onto the tree, landing hard against the rough wood. The cub was shivering, coughing up water, its tiny body heaving against his chest. Jack cradled it instinctively, adrenaline surging through him. He had done it, but now a new fear crept in. Where was the mother? His head snapped up, scanning the dense tree line. His pulse pounded in his ears. If the mother bear had seen him take her cub, he was in grave danger. But the forest remained silent. Jack looked down at the trembling cub in his arms. Its fur was ice cold, its breathing shallow. It needed warmth, and fast. Gritting his teeth, he wrapped it in his flannel shirt, shielding it from the cutting wind. He needed to decide what to do next. He could leave the cub and back away, hoping its mother would return. But if she hadn't already, what were the chances she ever would? He glanced at the river. Had she been swept away too? The thought made his stomach turn. If that was the case, this cub had no chance on its own. As he knelt there on the fallen tree, holding the shivering bundle in his arms, Jack realized he had made a choice the moment he'd reached into that river. He wasn't going to let the cub die. Taking a deep breath, He rose to his feet, adjusting the cub against his chest. The forest suddenly felt bigger, the trees looming taller, the silence heavier. He had saved the cub's life, but now he had no idea what was coming next. Jack held the tiny bear cub close to his chest, feeling the tremors rack its fragile body. The poor thing was still shivering violently, its wet fur clinging to its thin frame. He had always been told that wild animals, especially predators, should be left alone, but at this moment, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. The cub was helpless, and without its mother, it had no chance of survival. The weight of responsibility settled onto his shoulders like an axe left too long in the rain. Heavy and unavoidable, he looked around, scanning the dense tree line for any sign of movement. If the mother was still alive and nearby, she would surely appear soon, drawn by the scent and sounds of her cub. But the forest remained eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs, just the steady murmur of the river behind him. Something about that stillness unsettled him. Jack knelt on the damp ground, adjusting the cub in his arms. It made a weak whimpering noise, burrowing into the fabric of his flannel shirt. Its tiny claws scraped against his chest, grasping at warmth, and Jack felt something stir deep within him, an instinct he hadn't known existed. He had never cared for a wild animal before, never even had a pet growing up. But now, in the middle of the wilderness, he was responsible for a life that wasn't his own. He knew he had to act fast. The cub was soaked to the bone, its body dangerously cold. If he didn't get it warm soon, it wouldn't make it through the next few hours. He needed to get back to his camp, where he had dry blankets and a fire. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, half expecting to see a full-grown bear barreling toward him in a fit of rage. But there was nothing, only the whisper of the wind through the evergreens. Jack tightened his grip on the cub and started moving. His camp wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute hike, but the trail was rough and his arms were full. He trudged through the underbrush, careful to keep his footing on the uneven terrain. Every now and then, the cub let out a weak whimper, and each time, Jack spoke softly to it, as if his voice alone could keep it tethered to life. When he finally reached the clearing where his tent was set up, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The fire pit still held the smoldering remains of last night's embers, and his gear was stacked neatly beneath the rain tarp. It wasn't much, but for the moment, it was the best shelter the cub was going to get. Jack knelt by the fire pit, shifting the cub to one arm as he worked to reignite the flames. He stacked fresh kindling and struck his flint, sending a cascade of sparks onto the dry wood. Within minutes, a small fire flickered to life, casting a warm glow against the darkening sky. He sat back and pulled the cub closer, letting the heat seep into its frozen limbs. The little bear stirred, letting out a faint whine before curling deeper into Jack's chest. It was still weak, but at least it was breathing steadily now. That was a good sign. Jack reached into his pack and pulled out an old wool blanket. He wrapped it around the cub, tucking it in carefully. Then, as the fire crackled softly, he leaned back against a fallen log and let the exhaustion wash over him. The day had been longer than he realized, and now, with the adrenaline fading, he could feel the strain in his muscles. He had never planned for something like this. He was just a logger, a worker who spent his days chopping and clearing, following orders from men who had done this job long before him. He wasn't a wildlife rescuer. He wasn't even sure what he was supposed to do next. But as he sat there, watching the cub breathe softly in his lap, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just leave it. The night was quiet, the distant hoot of an owl, the only sound breaking the silence. The cub was sleeping now, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. Jack sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. He needed a plan. He couldn't keep the cub forever. Eventually, it would have to return to the wild. But if its mother was gone, it would need help getting strong enough to survive. Maybe he could find a wildlife rescue center, someone who knew how to care for orphaned animals. But they were miles from the nearest town, and Jack had no phone, no way to call for help. His only option was to hike out in the morning and see if he could get a signal somewhere along the ridge. Until then, he would have to keep the cub safe. Jack threw a few more logs onto the fire, watching as the flames grew higher. He pulled his sleeping bag closer, wrapping the cub inside with him. He had never slept next to a bear before, but as he listened to its soft, rhythmic breathing, he found himself relaxing. Tomorrow, he would figure everything out. But for now, all that mattered was that the cub was alive. The next morning, Jack woke to the feel of something small and warm pressed against his chest. The cub was still curled up against him, its fur dry now, its breathing slow and steady. He sat up carefully, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light through the trees. The cub stirred as he moved, letting out a tiny yawn before blinking up at him with sleepy eyes. For a moment, Jack just stared at it, struck by how small it really was. Without its mother, it was completely vulnerable. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Well, little guy," he murmured, "looks like it's just you and me for now." He stood, stretching out his sore muscles before stoking the fire. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten much the night before. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out some dried meat and a granola bar. He doubted the cub would eat anything he had, but it needed food just as much as it needed warmth. Jack tore a small piece of his granola bar and held it out. The cub sniffed at it, wrinkling its tiny nose before turning away. Jack chuckled. "Picky, huh? Can't say I blame you." He would have to figure something else out. Maybe find some berries or something more natural for the cub to eat. As he stood, preparing to scout for food, a sudden rustling in the trees made him freeze. His heart leapt into his throat as he turned toward the noise. The cub, sensing something, let out a small, frightened whimper and buried its face against Jack's chest. Jack's pulse pounded. Something was coming, and whatever it was big. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the rustling in the trees grew louder. His muscles tensed, and his grip on the cub tightened instinctively. The little bear whimpered again, pressing itself against him, its tiny body trembling. Jack had seen enough wildlife encounters in his years working in the forest to know that when something that big was moving, it was either a deer or something much, much more dangerous. Then, through the thick underbrush, a massive, dark shape emerged. A bear, a full-grown black bear, her thick fur rippling with power, her dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent every alarm in Jack's body blaring. Her nostrils flared, and her gaze flickered to the cub in his arms. Jack's mind raced. This was the mother. His instincts screamed at him to back away slowly, to put the cub down and let nature take its course. He had spent enough time in the woods to know that no man, not even one with a hatchet or a hunting rifle, stood a chance against a mother bear defending her young. If she thought, for even a second, that he was a threat, this could end in disaster. And yet, she wasn't charging. Jack stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, waiting for her to let out an earth-shattering roar, to lunge at him in a frenzy of claws and teeth. But she didn't. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, her ears twitching. The cub let out a weak, pitiful cry. The mother bear stopped in her tracks. Jack exhaled shakily, forcing himself to remain calm. Slowly, very slowly, he crouched down and placed the cub on the soft moss-covered ground between them. The little bear stumbled slightly, its legs still weak from the ordeal in the river, but when it turned toward its mother, it let out another cry, this one louder, more urgent. The mother bear's ears perked. She took another step forward, then another, her nose sniffing the air. Jack didn't move, didn't breathe. The tension was suffocating. Then, something astonishing happened. Instead of immediately rushing forward to scoop up her cub, the bear stopped just a few feet away from Jack. She lowered her head slightly, her eyes locked onto him. Not with rage, not with the wild fury he had expected, but with something else entirely. Recognition. Jack felt his breath hitch. She knew. Somehow, she knew what had happened. She could smell it on her cub, smell the river, the dampness, the remnants of Jack's scent mixed in with it. Maybe she even smelled the smoke from his campfire, the warmth that had helped save her baby's life. And then the impossible happened. The mother bear let out a deep, rumbling huff. Not a growl, not a warning, but something softer, almost deliberate. A sound of understanding. Jack stayed completely still as she took the last few steps forward and finally nosed her cub gently, sniffing it from head to tail as if confirming that it was truly hers. The cub responded immediately, making a small chirping sound and rubbing its face against her massive foreleg. A wave of relief crashed over Jack, so hard he nearly collapsed. He had done it. The cub was back where it belonged. But just as he began to inch backward, thinking this was a moment where he would make his quiet escape, the mother bear did something that left him utterly speechless. She looked at him again, held his gaze in a way that no wild animal ever had before, and then she lowered her head. For a fraction of a second, Jack thought he was imagining it. But no, the bear was lowering her massive head toward the ground, her breathing slow and deliberate, as if bowing. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. Was this gratitude? Everything in his mind screamed that this was impossible, that bears didn't express thanks, that this was just an animal acting on instinct. But as he stared into the mother's deep, dark eyes, he knew. She understood. She knew that he had saved her cub. Jack felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. He had never believed in things like spiritual connections or unspoken bonds between man and beast. But this moment was something different, something primal, something ancient. He didn't move, didn't even dare to blink as the bear straightened again. Then, without another sound, she gently scooped up the cub in her massive jaws and turned back toward the forest. Jack watched in stunned silence as she disappeared into the trees, her dark form melting into the shadows as though she had never been there at all. The rustling of leaves slowly faded, and then nothing. Only the quiet hum of the forest remained. Jack let out a shaky breath and ran a hand through his hair, his heart still pounding. He sat back on his heels, staring at the empty space where the bear had stood just moments before. What had just happened? Had a bear really just thanked him? He exhaled a breathless laugh, shaking his head. No one would believe him. If he told his co-workers or anyone back in town, they'd say he was crazy. They'd tell him that bears don't show gratitude, that he had just been lucky the mother didn't attack him on sight. And yet he knew what he had seen. That bear had bowed to him. Jack sat there for a long time, his mind replaying every detail of the encounter over and over. Finally, as the last of the morning chill faded and the sun rose higher over the treetops, he pushed himself to his feet. His job here wasn't done. There was still work to be finished, trees to be cleared, a fire break to be maintained. But somehow, everything felt different now. The forest didn't seem as wild, as untamed as it had before. It felt connected, like he was part of it in a way he had never been before. Jack took one last look toward the trees, half expecting to see the mother bear watching from a distance. But she was gone. He smiled to himself, shook his head, and picked up his axe. Life in the wilderness was unpredictable, but sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when you least expected them.